Where does that go?
Okay, now it's official.
All right. Hey, Tho, welcome very much to, I guess, what I'm going to call my initial political science with Jeff Shipley, Representative Jeff Shipley, I should say. And I think the reason why it's kind of interesting is I was a student of political science at the once prestigious University of Iowa. I didn't even know what that term meant until after I graduated. And lately now, obviously with the state of the world, I'm thinking about the political science quite a bit. And actually, I think it's pretty important. That it's important to understanding how our society works and our place in society. And I see people like Thomas Massie, who's a very great congressman, kind of dismissing political science. And yeah, I'll concede maybe political science isn't quite as captivating as like, CRISPR gene editing or some of these other new fields of scientific inquiry. But I think political science is pretty dang important. And so that's what I want to talk today with you about and just get to know you a little bit better. So I guess just to start off with, though, just I don't know you well enough to introduce you, but we've had some good conversations in the past. It's some great Twitter interactions. So just why don't you just go ahead and tell us about yourself and who are you and what are you doing in this world?
Yeah, well, again, thank you for having me, and I always enjoy our back and forths. And I definitely think that you're perhaps the most interesting state rep in America, perhaps outside of Florida. Gotta always give my boy Sabatini some props. But I agree with you. I find myself more attracted to the actual concept of political science and a deeper appreciation for it than I have in the past. And I think one of the reasons why someone like Massie or a lot of libertarians out there kind of look down upon it is because precisely what you referred to earlier about how what we are often told as political science is often just kind of LARPing politics rather than truly looking at the dynamics of power as it exists. And me myself, my background in politics is a little interesting because my father was one of the big Republican operatives in the 60s and 70s. So like the era of, the South becoming Republican, a lot of the changes during the GOP. My father was communications director for the National Party during the Watergate days, which was a lot of fun. He had to testify during Watergate. He had me much later in life, which kind of helps the time frame here.
Oh, wow. What was his testimony?
He just had to talk about some of the Republic, what he had heard in some of the official Republic, but Thompson, or Bill, who was the Law and Order actor?
Fred Thompson.
Yeah, he was the attorney that got a subpoena.
Wow.
My dad was also big in Alabama politics. That was kind of one of his bases, and so the interaction between legal proceedings and candidates is very mainstream in Alabama. I think like every other governor ends up in jail down there. But so I was raised in this, kind of very political world. Even my mom was, back in the day, she was the first female field person for the Republican Party of Florida. And so she was hanging around in like the Roger Stone, young Republican days.
Wait, so are you trying to tell me that your mother is a woman pioneer in the field of politics?
In Florida politics, she is.
Wow, what a hero.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I was born on August 9th, 1989. And if you go back 9 months.
Wait, did we talk about this already?
I saw it on your Wikipedia page. We have not talked about this, but I saw it on your Wikipedia page that we have.
You're 8/9/89.
Yes.
Oh my goodness. Now, what do you think that means? Because that was actually the question that you're dodging. I wanted to ask, who are you and what are you doing on this world?
Yes.
So what happened on 8/9/89 when you were birthed into existence and God said, I guess God didn't call you Tho, that would have been your mother,
right.
But so yeah, just give us a big frame perspective of who you are and what you're doing on this planet.
Yeah, I'm trying to save the world. That's which is
save it from what?
From the destruction of civilization.
Cool.
And I think this actually kind of goes back to that larger point is that I think that we take for granted the existence of human thriving. And I think that it's very easy for us as a species to lose what it is to be human, to destroy what
Wow.
better people before us has built. And one of the things that I've become increasingly convinced of is the importance of religion and particularly Christianity to the prosperity of humanity. Because that's always been the guiding light of uniquely Western civilization.
All right. Slow down. Let's take this one at a time. Now we're getting, so I think you kind of hit on a key point, because I think this is what separates maybe the red pill from the blue pill. And like something that I, even when I was kind of mocking my political science education, something I was kind of keen on understanding was what causes a society to rise, what causes a society to fall. And again, this kind of cycles in history where obviously the Soviet Union being maybe a more recent example, but other empires as well. And hopefully we can talk about antiquity in Greece and Rome, and kind of how, societies would prosper and thrive and bring about some sort of golden age of greatness for their citizens. And then somehow they would naturally just, just self-destruct under the weight of their own hubris or whatever. And you sounded a lot like, I think that's why I love Jordan Peterson so much, and why I kind of view him as like, I think he's red pilled and blue pilled at the same time. It almost seems like, where he'll talk about just how important some of these esoteric concepts or mythology, how there's a lot of like importance in terms of these grand overarching archetypes and narratives, and who we are as human beings, having this kind of unlimited potential that God sets before us. And then somehow he also kind of takes, so to me, like that's the ultimate red pill of self-empowerment, right? That we as individuals have agency to change the world in some way. I don't know if I'd use the verb save, because I don't know, like, well, one, that's very interesting. The idea that the world needs saving.
Yes.
Humanity maybe, and then, but I mean, the world is kind of its own entity that's going to exist. And that's why I love the George Carlin bit about like the earth just shaking off humans like a bunch of fleas or ticks or something. Like, anyway, so yeah, that's, I guess, a lot of interesting points in terms of like the big, and where we are now. I guess we could just dive right into it, because you've done a lot of good work about the free state of Florida, and where Florida exists really as a global leader of freedom at this point in time. And then where we are just in the American experiment, where it's been a couple hundred years. America's had a pretty good run, but when we kind of take a cold, hard look at, say, the balance sheet, so to speak, or cultural degradation, and even just the disunity of the fabric that binds us together as a nation, whether that's standing for the national anthem or agreeing that America is a good place to live or a non-evil place to live. So I guess, where do you just see, just give me your honest opinion on your present analysis of the American experiment, and where you see us in that overarching theme of time.
Well, I think that currently we're seeing the biggest challenge to what the American empire, which I think is the only way to see it, since it was firmly established. And I think to appreciate that time frame, one of the things I think is interesting right now is that I think it's become very normalized to understand that, for one, the powers that be in America, at least at the federal level, democracy is purely a ceremonial act. That the real levers of power are with the technocrats and not the elected officials. And this is very clear with Fauci and the Fed and the warfare state and all of that.
But hold on, let me interrupt you just for a second, because the media, like, they insisted on Fauci being fawned over by the public, when they do the media appearances. So I think that was critical to the governing structure, is that you get, and I don't want to be disparaging, but I think the political science term might be useful idiot, although we can talk about what that actually means and if it's a useful term or not. But there is a tangible political utility to have the people fawning over Fauci, worshiping him. And anyway, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to throw that in there.
Oh, no, I'm personality cults. And I think this is something that libertarians in particular kind of take for granted, is that, like, it's like that old Eleanor Roosevelt quote about how, like, good minds talk about people, great mind, or average minds talk about people, good minds talk about events. Great minds talk about ideas, and people use that usually kind of pat themselves on the back, thinking I'm a great mind because I talk about ideas. But I think the key there is like the importance of people as a driver for society. Like history has always had those sort of icons, and so the media was trying to create Fauci into a secular state of medical expertise, because you need that in order for that technocracy to really get into its stride, which particularly given all the additional powers they were wielding in COVID, like you needed that sort of faith in that system. But again, it's not a democratic system. And I think that if we look back at it, really the growth of that controlled power apparatus is, you can trace it all the way back to like after the Civil War. And particularly, it's interesting, 1876, 100 years after, the Declaration, right? You have the first stolen election in American history. It's after the corruption, it's after the Grant administration, Rutherford Hayes, and kind of that cements like Republican control of post-Civil War America for like 26 years. It's a crazy long control.
Wait, so who stole the election from whom? I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, so that's an interesting piece of it. So the election of 1876, this was after, and it's a fascinating piece of history because imagine this, and this is going completely off topic, but I think it gets relevant at the end. So think about after post-Civil War America, right? You have the equivalent of the only other figure in American history, I mean, most recognized general in the world at this point, Ulysses S. Grant takes over as president. And like, imagine, it's like if you look back and think about the founding of America, if George Washington was a vulgar, corrupt leader, that's what Ulysses S. Grant was. Now, Washington had other issues, but but he wasn't Ulysses S. Grant, right? It was, and so you had the Republican Party became a party of control and corruption, because obviously you still had federal troops controlling the former states of the Confederacy, right? Liberal military power. And you also had the rise of the railroad industry, which is like the most politically connected industry in American history because of land grants and things like that.
Yeah.
The period of peak corruption, vulgar corruption.
Vulgar, you mean like just more pronounced and where it's easy to be undeniable.
Yes.
Yeah.
And like, so you had that running, and Grant was kind of looking at running again, but he couldn't because he had scandal after scandal. And so from the Democratic Party becomes one of the most fascinating men that never gets talked about. His name's Samuel Tilden. He was a former railroad attorney. He was like the richest man to ever run for president. And because he was a railroad attorney, he knew like where the bodies were buried. And so his biggest claim to fame was taking down Boss Tweed, one of the biggest political corruption scandals in New York history, which for New York history, that says a lot. Mm-hmm. And
so up until COVID, you mean?
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so here you have literally the Democratic Party putting the figure of good government, and also a brilliant man. I mean, he was a proto-Austrian. He was a political heir of Martin Van Buren. Fascinating line of political history. The Bourbon Democrats, which are like the most free market political group we ever had in American history, versus the Republican Party, which put up Rutherford Hayes, who was just an afterthought. He was a governor of Ohio. Nobody thought he was going to be the nominee, and he just represented. He was outside of D.C., so that was good. And then what ended up happening is that the night of the election, everyone knows that Tilden won. It's very obvious. But the New York Times runs an article as an explicitly Republican publication saying that, oh, well, results aren't in. We don't, there's still, question marks here. Because of that, Ulysses S. Grant calls and mobilizes federal troops in these, again, former Confederate areas, and they take control of the ballot boxes. And so you have the Democrats in these states and the Republicans in these states both coming to Washington with contrasting ballots. And it turns, again, like, the Republicans are offering a different ballot count like you had the night of the election. They can to show Hayes. And so, there's 4 states at play, which is similar to 2020. And they end up having going to Washington, and they have this massive commission on it. And things get so bad that like the commission was going to be like equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats plus like 3 or like an odd number of Supreme Court justices. Well, like one of the Supreme Court justices ends up getting offered a Senate position from the Democrats because they think they've effectively bribed him, but then he gets another bribe and he sits out entirely. I mean, it was bad. And here you have Samuel Tilden, who was offered multiple times, like, hey, look, if you simply pay these Republican officials this amount of money, they'll give you the presidency. And he refused to do so. And then he was sold out because many Democrats in power did not actually care about fixing the corruption of Washington. They wanted to be in on the corruption.
Right.
It's like one of the pieces
right.
of trade. So that's where you had the removal of federal troops from the South, plus the postmaster general position was given to a Democratic partisan. It was an explicit cash grab. Because the postmaster general at that point was like the king of spoils.
All right.
So this is the backtrack. So everything that we've built on, like that is when then Republicans controlled federal power for a long time, and then after that, you effectively had the collapse. Then it brought us to you had a kind of brief period with Grover Cleveland, but after that you had the Progressive Revolution, but that was where the power apparatus of Washington power really grew. Like it took advantage of all the war powers of the Civil War. It baked in crony capitalism to its.
But in the name,
well,
and they did that in the name of fixing a lot of these problems. Anyway, okay, so a couple things. First, while we're on that story, I was unfamiliar with any of that history, which is kind of embarrassing. Where did you learn that?
Well, I just got interested in Sam Tilden because I got interested in the Bourbon Democrats, and then
Bourbon Democrats.
It's a fascinating period, a school of thought. It was kind of like post-Civil War Jacksonians. So like you get all the best of the Jacksonians without any of the slave issues in the Civil War. And then, but then like after the election of 2020, like I got big, I went to go deeper in that specific issue. And one of the best books out there is by Gore Vidal, who it's a fictional book, but it's grounded in history. So it's actually more like it tells you like a street side level. There's all sorts of great books on it, but it's a fascinating period of history. And again, to me, like that's within there's a lot of libertarian or a lot of people in kind of Austro-libertarian sphere that will point to like the Civil War as being the corruptive influence. But to me, it's the reaction to the Civil War that really bakes into a lot of these. That's really where the Republic in any sort of sense truly fell. And that's what we have to recognize is that the structure of the government of the structure of the American federal government is not whatever the Constitution represents. It is not a continuation of the Washington administration. We had a profoundly different structure of government post-Civil War, and we pretend that we're still living in a republic. And this is precisely what creates the facade that allows the technocrats to have so much power.
There's a lot of historical analysis for a political science podcast. I'm trying to, but no, that's fascinating. But I guess, okay, this reveals a couple things. One, just, the importance of history and kind of understanding the story and that's what always kind of surprised me too, when you talk to say entitled teenagers who are like, oh, why do I have to learn history? It's like, oh, well, do you want to have any sort of semblance of like connection to the reality of the world you're living in? So, I mean, just these kind of, and I think, I don't want to get too far off on things I don't know, but I think Murray Rothbard made a lot of historical contributions that were very unique. And I think really made him stand out. But going back to, just Ulysses S. Grant and touching on how military science also often intersects with political science. That's something I definitely want to get into. But again, taking it back to the very basic thing, when we're talking about how power is derived from people, what do you do as an individual to connect with people and not use people, but you connect with people and network with people to leverage and create political power, political capital for yourself? Walk me through that.
Yeah. So I again, this is something that I think is a major blind spot in a lot of areas, because like political action is not you yourself having an opinion. It is being able to get other people to take your opinion seriously. And I think particularly in an age like this, where, like one of you mentioned Murray Rothbard. And that's where I get really excited about the topic of political science, because I think that so Murray Rothbard was obviously was a member of the Austrian school of thought. And I think this is really important because the Austrians had a different entire view of social sciences generally. So there was a praxeological approach, which I think I think political science, there are elements of praxeological analysis that can be useful to understand.
Define praxeological for the audience.
Praxeology is the study of human action. And so it is an understanding basically, that we are human beings. We have free will, or at least something that resembles it, right? We all have individual values, different ends, different techniques. And so that any sort of understanding of larger social phenomenon has to take into account the uniquely reasoning ability of human beings, and there's a way, and it is a study to try to understand the consequences in a world of scarcity human beings making purposeful actions have. It's a lot of economic science, for example, which economics is the most fleshed out discipline within that because of Austrian's economics, right? Economics is a subset because there's all sorts of human actions where we're making decisions that are not economic in nature. If deciding to do this podcast, right? I mean, that was not a market behavior, but it is you making.
Well, it was because the economy of time, I mean, is real. You had to do a cost benefit of, is this worth your time?
There's ways of kind of breaking it down and kind of a price calculation there, but there's all sorts of ways that we interact with others in society.
Well, hold on, though. I have to interject because lately I've been finding myself talking about economizing my cellular data resources, at least as an excuse to avoid doing Zoom calls with constituents.
You don't want exposure. So within that, what I find about Rothbard's work so well is that he was so deeply steeped into history, and his perspective of history was firmly in this lens of liberty versus power. And from that, he drove political, he drew political lessons, lessons of what.
Well, he was an activist.
Yes.
Just say it like that. He was an activist. He was engaged.
He wasn't just a brilliant scholar. He was also an activist in the field.
Right. He wanted to put those ideas into action and test them against his fellow human beings and at least see where, what would stick, so to speak. That I'm going to put all my ideas up against the wall. And if I can at least get the anti-war one to stick, then I'm going to explore whatever that stickiness is. Cause that's, I don't know enough about the man, I guess so.
Yeah, he also recognized that having a very strong opinion about a political structure isn't the same thing as understanding the structures of power. Like you can have a big opinion about what the world should look like, but that doesn't tell you anything about how you go about making the world closer to that point. And so one of the mechanisms that Rothbard advocated, particularly when you recognize that the power structures are so corrupted, is that the only way you can solve this, since you cannot fix that corrupted system from within, you can only do it by having the people, force the people to lose its to break the faith that it has in the governing apparatus.
Or just act differently.
Yes.
Act differently. No, okay. I have so many thoughts here. I'm having a hard time keeping up. I guess, but that was the first one Murray Rothbard was engaged. Now going back to the question, because you're also a political activist, are you not?
Yes.
And so I guess just describe, just very briefly, what strategies you employ. I guess, what is your current political position? Why do you feel like it's a political advantage for you to hold that position? And just how have you been able to connect with people to get that position? Or how has your position been a function of connecting with people?
Yeah. So I'm vice chairman of the Bay County Republican Party here.
What's Bay County? How many people live there?
It's less than 200,000. It is we're right in the middle.
So that's a small county for Florida.
Yes.
But in a state like Iowa or even in Alabama, 200,000 people in a county is very populous and is a lot of people. And that's the other thing too, like how I think people kind of dismiss, like, oh, this is beneath me, or, oh, it's just city council in a small town. But I guess it really matters. Like, even though it's 200,000 is minuscule by Florida standards, that's still, by Bay County standards, it's still very, very significant. Yeah. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, and obviously the impact you can actually have on policy at a local level, that's why you have people that.
What? And then how many vice chairs are there? Is there just one chairman and then one vice chair? Or are you among several vice chairs?
Yep. No, there's one chairman, one vice chairman.
What did you have to do to get that position? Did you have to beat anyone?
Yes, I had an opponent, someone I liked, but I had been prior to that. I'm president of another Republican organization here, the Republican Roundtable, and one of the things that's allowed me to have, I have a lot of people that I think, and I'm not to toot my own horn, but I have a lot of people that here locally that respect what I have to say about these issues. And one of the things that I have done, I think, to help strengthen that is, for one, actually have something original to say. I do a lot, my political opinion is not simply because I saw something on Twitter. Like I've got I've got.
You've read some books. You've read
Yes.
Gore Vidal.
Yes. I'm proud of my background in economics and history and political thought.
You've probably read some John Maynard Keynes too.
A little bit.
Yeah. Hopefully not too much, but enough.
I have some experience behind the curtain. I did work up in Washington, D.C. for a little over 3 years, the House Financial Services Committee as Deputy Communications Director. So that got me some,
How'd you get that job?
I got it because my father, he had a client.
Oh, nepotism?
Well, it helped open the opportunity. So one of my father's clients, Spencer Backus, he became chairman of the Financial Services Committee after the Tea Party Revolution in 2010.
Subcommittee.
The full committee. The Financial
Ron was
Services
chair?
Committee. Ron Paul was a subcommittee chairman, but Spencer Backus was chairman.
Oh,
and so
okay,
I worked for Spencer Backus.
My fault. I'm sorry. I got to stop interrupting you. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And so I was at the time reading a lot of these, the histories and the economic texts, but I was a college dropout working as a barista, and I had had a meeting. My father couldn't make a meeting because of health reasons, and so my mom came and she brought me along because I could kind of help her. And the conversation with Congressman Backus came up. He was working on an op-ed about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the financial crisis. This is something I'd been studying, and so I mentioned, hey, these are the scholars that predicted it. They have some things that I think will help your argument. I drafted a 10-page summary of, the Austrian analysis of the housing crisis. And he hired me to work as a staff assistant for the committee that he was filling out.
So you just pitched an unsolicited scholarly report to a congressman and it was good enough to get a job?
Well, he asked me for it after he was like, oh yeah, can you send me some stuff on it? And so I went very thorough. I think I gave more than he was expecting, but I was very thorough.
Get the send me some stuff is typically, yes. I guess that's sometimes a very political ruse to just get someone away from you. But I guess I'll say this is a good time to mention this, persistence and follow through. I am just so shocked, serving in my position, just how many people say they're going to do something, whether it's as simple as sending an email and then just never do it. And then it so clearly indicates that, it must not have been very important to you. Because if it was important, you would have done what you said you were going to do.
Right.
And so here's something where you had that opportunity and then you did such a good job that it translated into, this is useful. I would be willing to pay to have this guy around.
Yeah. That was the opportunity. And
but it was self-created. I just want to underscore this kind of point that it's not like they went directly to you and said, Tho, we need to know your perspective on which Austrians predicted the crisis. You put yourself in the right spot at the right time, took initiative that clearly demonstrated a quality or a virtue that was worth having. And so, my previous joke about nepotism, I guess there's truth to the fact that it is very important for the parents. It's a parent's responsibility to give their children opportunities, but it's obviously the child's opportunity to walk through those doors and connect those final pieces to demonstrate that virtue or the quality that translates into actually a paid political gig.
And it was interesting seeing when I got up there, the thing is, the worst kept secret on the Hill is that in order to get on the Hill, you either need some sort of foot in the door, either from it always helps your parents a very powerful lobbyist or donors. You have the luxury of having an internship where you can afford to eat that cost. But what's interesting is that once you get on the Hill, it's actually fairly meritocratic, and it was interesting that, for one, recognizing just how little your average congressperson understood about the committees that they were on.
Right.
And then you see how much control staffers have on the entire process. If you're a committee policy staffer, you have more influence than but maybe 60 members of Congress, because of that's where all the details are actually, and I'm being generous there, where the details are worked out. And it's because of the fact I was interested in economics and had this background that, I was able to get elevated before a lot of other people that came in with me. And most importantly for me, I was able to help Ron Paul's office since he was a subcommittee chairman. And that was a lot of fun because when I actually had an ideological cause, it's amazing little opportunities you have to, get a link in front of members here, provide help for a hearing here, Like I helped get Ron Paul an extra 5 minutes with Ben Bernanke during his last hearing because I had this idea about wielding time and this sort of stuff. And it's like if you have a cause, like there's a lot of opportunity behind the scenes, and I always appreciated that sort of strategic aspect to it. And so, but because
that's the concept of proximity to power, essentially, that there are power centers and there are people that if you're closer to them, like in literal distance, then you're able to influence. And so proximity to power is kind of what you're describing there.
Yes. And ultimately that's what matters. That's and all of the great ideas and the best intentions at play, if you don't have an ability to make them relevant, again, either by mobilizing enough people to help propel you, like especially in a democratic society, into having a position of power, or not having
I'd say the merits to get your way in the meritocracy. I mean, I think that's where I see things. I'm trying to find some sort of track or thread to think this, but the libertarians that are so nose too up in the air that they would never, take the time to write out their thoughts because they expect people to be as smart as them and just get it, that they want to skip through these different steps. They don't take the time to actually spell it out, write it down, and present it in a format that a congressman would acknowledge that it exists or be reckoned with. And I guess just some of these libertarian activists are so, that was something I wanted to explore, but I guess just first go back, because the question was,
what am I doing?
Well, why are you the vice chair of Bay County Republicans? Why is that an advantage? Why is that something you wanted to have? And then tell me about how you beat your opponent and stuff.
Yeah. So one of the, I've become really appreciative of the importance of kind of political party structures.
Right.
Because one of the things that really I think I've kind of appreciated is you need institutions. You need, ideas alone don't matter. You have to have institutions that can help provide platforms and organization and engage seriously with processes. So for example, as vice chairman of the Republican Party, I've got platforms where I can help identify local issues, and particularly considering in local politics where nobody there's not a lot of places where people actually get engaged. If you can help move the needle on, for example, we had a vote on a local property tax referendum, right? We were able to use the following of the party.
How'd the vote go?
Organize for it. And one of the things I think, particularly in the Trump era, is that the GOP brand, as long as it is seen under that banner of the beloved Trump figure, that is obviously true in the Panhandle, Florida. There might be some areas where the Republican Party might be a little bit different. I think this is probably true in most, though. The more that you could help. What I had fun with is bridging the populist excitement of Trump, the theater of Trump, into the local party. Because once you started doing so, you made the local party relevant to your average Trump supporter who otherwise doesn't really care outside the voting booth once every 2 or 4 years. Right. And so what to me is important in a democratic system is for people to feel represented. And I don't mean that in again, they just vote, but they actually see people in the community that sound like them, that have their same angers, their same fears, their same hopes, their same ideals. And the problem is that politics had become very boring and controlled by consultants and, reduced into kind of, this, very, over battles that were never actually going to be governed. And Trump brought excitement and freshness and new energy. And that to me is the most interesting dynamic of modern American politics. And it's something that the Republican Party, to me, in order to be valuable, has to tap into. And it is something that I think I have been in a good position to do at a local level in Bay County, because I think I appreciate this larger populist movement.
So when did you get elected vice chair?
Let's pass December. Is it December 2020?
Oh, so you're relatively new to the position. Mm-hmm. And what were you serving in the party before that?
I was president of the Republican Roundtable, which is kind of our social club. And I was also our communications
Okay, so you had a volunteer role.
Yeah.
And important. I mean, again, communication is important because that's what's being said. And politics basically is just one series of communications, one after another. I mean, my job is basically just communicating. Oh shoot, what was I going to say here? How did that tax vote go? Did you guys have that yet?
Yeah. Yep, it happened in April. And
what was the outcome? Was it what you wanted?
75-25 defeated.
Okay, so a couple things you said. I would say, like you said, people. I would say people do care more often, but it's difficult because it's time consuming, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's the thing too that I think kind of the. I just recently did the Tom Woods show or whatever, and there's this kind of libertarian culture. I don't know how many people it is, if it's 5,000 or 10,000 or 50,000, but there's this kind of population of libertarian activists that are trying to kind of, find their way or just kind of establish themselves. And it just seems like they're really not understanding the importance of, I guess, connecting with people, and that to an extent, I mean, people want to be led, right?
Yes.
Well, this is what I meant to say. For the people, and certainly like in the Austro-libertarian sphere, who go really deep in the different economists and are very like the intellectuals, like a guy like Walter Block is so far removed from just mainstream life and what typical people deal with on a daily basis. And even like something today with like the news coming out of the Fauci emails, which are kind of pretty big smoking guns that probably embarrass and hopefully lead to the criminal prosecution of one of the most notorious career bureaucrats that ever existed. The average person is still like, they're not in the weeds. They probably don't even know what gain of function research consists of. They've just made a value judgment on their own, either a while ago or from day to day, based on how they're going to behave versus the circumstances that they need to endure to get through their daily life, which often includes, things like career and family and other very important considerations that, not everyone can relate to or whatever. So I think that's like, if I was to put my kind of finger on it, of like, there's the collective psyche, there's the masses, so to speak, there are the people, and then there are the activists that are trying to, win the attention or win the influence or win the leadership role over. And I mean, people, I think sheep, I don't use that term disparagingly. I mean, I'm a sheep, right? Like, I'm shepherded by guys like you. I'm shepherded by the Mises Institute. I'm shepherded by Young Americans for Liberty. I'm shepherded by Bobby Kennedy Jr. Like, so I'm a sheep that's shepherded along by other leaders. And society's kind of the same way. We're all just kind of a bunch of sheep sitting around wondering which way we're going to go in trust. And there's a lot of things that I think libertarians just kind of miss about just social dynamics and connecting with people. And it often comes from this kind of over-intellectualizing and having their heads so far up their own butt or so far in like a book that they're so far removed from just the average concerns of typical people, and thus are unable to connect and are kind of wondering like, oh, if only these people were as smart as I was, we'd get the government that we want. And there's like, that to me is really just frankly repulsive, unsocial human behavior that deserves to be relegated to the fringes, because it's just not empathetic to or not responsive to the true needs of the people. And so I guess let's just kind of get into this kind of libertarian dynamic, because you've been a critic of the Libertarian Party, as am I. We've had some Twitter exchanges, what actually prompted me getting this schedule, where there was this one of these Libertarian Party of Georgia. I don't know the guy. He seemed to have a position. And it was just the most pathetic thing I'd ever seen from like a political activist, where, he didn't disagree that any of the accomplishments I listed, the accomplishments that the Republican Party of Iowa was able to approach, where he disagreed on some gender identity related issues and use that as a red herring to totally discount the value of the Republican Party as an institution in the state of Iowa. And again, just defining broadly what an institution is, because that was a word you used. I mean, an institution is really just a collection of people and their thought forms kind of put in reality. So like the Republican Party of Iowa is really just a building and, you know, some names on a piece of paper and conventions and things. It's still very amorphous. So even when we use the term institution, it kind of makes it think like it's something that's crystallized or that maybe exists in some, you know, big monolithic building or something. But an institution could be as simple as, you know, 5 musicians getting together for music every Sunday or something. Like, so just, I just wanted to use that, make sure we're talking about the terms in the same way. Because I think that's another big part of the language is a lot of people just simply don't understand what these words mean. And a lot of these, like this kind of conversation, I mean, we're at kind of like a high school level political science analysis, and that's way over the heads of most everyone. I mean, probably 90% of the people. So I guess just give me some thoughts on just everything I just kind of said there, what you've seen from libertarian activists. And then obviously we can get into the Dave Smith interview if you want, because there's a couple of things that really stuck out over the course of that. But anyway, what are your comments or thoughts on things I just said?
No, I think you're correct. And then I think that there are 2 types of people that I think libertarianism attracts in particular. And this is broad brushes, and this does not describe everyone. But I think two groups are that have problems. One of that is I do think there's a lot of people who have no other sense of self-respect than their political views. And so there's a lot of libertarians that
which that's a big problem, it sounds like.
And this is always a big problem. It's interesting that, you know, I've been republishing articles from, you know, literally the 1990s from
the RRR.
Rothbard. Yes.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And you know, they talk about, because like that, like the American libertarian movement, like as a real thing, was like early 70s, and they're described as like, look, it's 20 years later, and these people haven't done anything. You know, they're you know, they expect to mooch off of fellow libertarians, and like they think that their professional niche is being a libertarian, whatever, right? You know, and the problem is that exists a lot. I mean, there's a lot of libertarians, and there's after like the Ron Paul movement, the problem is that there's a large enough sphere where people could get a lot of social media clout from just sharing like the same, like, you know, 20 libertarian slogans in a variety of forms, and think that they're doing something and think that makes them smart. The problem is that, you know, in the real world, like their relationships are purely online, and they also substitute their self-righteous views on the state as some sort of higher moral authority. And so that way, like if someone has a different view,
that's it.
Yeah,
that's it.
And like, so that's obviously like, it's just antisocial, as you mentioned, behavior. And really it's because it's about self-glorification more than it is about living in a more liberal world. And that's a mistake. The other side of it, and
but they think that they are somehow advancing the cause somehow, but the couple things I mean, the online culture, how a lot of these things just exist online, and it's very difficult to translate any of these conversations like in real life, because like obviously in real life, I'm never going to cross paths with the Atlanta LP guy or whatever. Like it's just never going to happen. It would only happen in this online space. So
the libertarian ghettos, they're online libertarian ghettos.
Wow. But yeah. All right. Sorry, there was a lot of keep going if you got. I'm just thinking out loud.
And then the other side of it, and these people are a lot less offensive, but they have similar problems politically, is that there are a lot of, you know, like Mises would talk about the autistic economy, like kind of the economy of an individual man on like an island and resources and things like that. There's a lot of libertarians that if are not, you know, genuinely autistic, they're at the very least politically autistic, where they're entirely inward focused. And there's nothing wrong with this at all. But like that's what, you know, they pride internal logical consistency more than they do external, you know, communication. Like this is what makes them comfortable. They like to retreat into what they think is the framework of a moral world, and therefore any interaction out of that is out of their comfort space. And so and the problem is, and the thing is that like if you're like an agorist as a political strategy, right, and your focus is simply how do you make you as an individual as free and as a little exposure to the state as possible, that's fine. That is a politically autistic strategy. but that's fine. The difficulty comes when you want to act as a political figure, if your interest is political action, it is running campaigns, it is winning elections, it is changing the ideas of your neighbors. And again, that's again, going back to the online thing, is that we would rather talk online amongst ourselves rather than talk to our neighbors in your physical reality.
Right. Well, is a part of that just because, I mean, these ideas there are a lot of instances. Well, one, because we're so far removed from that logical utopia, right?
Right.
I mean, we're so far removed, which is so funny too, because it's like, I mean, that's what the statists or the leftists use. Like, oh, what, you're going to get rid of the roads? Like, look at all the government we've accepted in our life. You're arguing against fire departments and police departments and roads. Like, we're so far removed from, I guess, whatever that vision is. And then how do you actually, because like what's going to be the very first step?
Right.
And I think that's part of the things why libertarians are so summarily dismissed by otherwise open-minded thinking people, is because they're not able to get from the rigid ideological even one step into the practical of even saying like, okay, this would be the very, very first step, because nothing's ever going to be good enough to satisfy their logical consistency that they pride and value so much. And so like, that's why all these conversations are a non-starter, and they're able to just be dismissed because a lot of times they're just saying things that come across as extraordinarily impractical.
Yeah. And that's where I think Rothbard's work is so interesting, going back to him, because like, Rothbard as a political activist, he made different coalitions. And so like during the Vietnam War era, because of his anti-war views, he became a member of New Left. Like he was trying to push libertarian ideas within the movement of the New Left and the opportunity that listed. And so you'll read about like what should be done. And it's very radical. It's, hey, all state property is illegitimate, and therefore we should support homesteading of all public property, and power to the people, take it back, and then you get to the 90s, and his political opinions have changed dramatically, where he's now writing about, okay, well, what do we do until privatization comes? And he's like, oh, well, if we try to like make our public schools as awful as possible, the result is not going to be people flocking into private education. It's going to be students being victims of bad education. Parents are going to hate anybody in charge. You're going to lose their favor. If you run a library into the ground and make it a homeless camp, people are going to hate you because you made their communities worse off. And so he recognizes that, look, like until we get to this, a more liberal world, we need to leverage whatever political power we have to make these institutions resemble liberal environments. And liberal environments have rules. It's not a free-for-all. There's property rights involved. There's respect for individuals. There's respect for cultures.
There's social norms and customs.
And those are going to change dramatically. What you may allow at a San Francisco public library as a libertarian administrator is going to be very different than what you allow in Iowa or the Panhandle.
There's better be if I got something to say about it.
Yeah, and that's the problem, is that libertarians, they have a lot of libertarians, their entire view of the world is from a narrow political lens, which is obviously self-contradictory if you're a libertarian, because we understand that the state, isn't the end-all be-all. And so if you do not appreciate the importance of non-state institutions, civil society, culture, morality that cannot simply be extrapolated from legal thin principles,
right,
then you're missing the world. You're rather retreat into a convenient model than engage with the world, because it ultimately, the only way that you're actually able to reduce the state is by building trust among neighbors and by developing pro-social cooperation. Libertarian at its best, markets at its best, is peaceful social cooperation. And that doesn't happen because you make a really strong logical argument for it. It doesn't happen because you create a power void. It happens because of common morality. And so ultimately, the biggest problem I think libertarians have is that we are so individualistic in nature. We have lied to ourselves that liberty is an individual right, when in reality, it is necessarily always a collective right. Because you can consider yourself a sovereign man and beyond all nations and all sorts of things. If you were living in a lockdown state, trying to act like that would end up with you taken down and your neighbors applauding them.
Right. Well, and maybe for good reason too.
Yeah.
Like,
you know,
well, so there's just so much to dive into. A couple of things that stuck out I want to comment on. So just how the one word you fell short of, but you talked about common morality, and then really what that leads to is trust. Yes. Because trust is the invisible social bond that allows, say, an economy to flourish, or even just live next to someone peacefully, that I can sleep soundly at night because I trust that if someone's lurking around, you know, my neighbors are going to have me back, because we have established this institution, this common collective that, hey, we're going to peacefully coexist in this neighborhood. And that means we all have to, you know, drive slowly down the street while the kids are playing, and just, you know, provide those decent social graces that are necessary for this. So just the common values, but trust is really what it is. Mm-hmm. And then also, you didn't say this explicitly, but just how not everyone really shares like the libertarian value of liberty, which carries a lot of risk, and like that entrepreneurship mindset. Mm-hmm. Of, oh, I'm going to invest here, and I might lose my investment, or I might get some really great returns for being a successful entrepreneur. Not everyone has that mindset. Right. There are a large number of people that love the comfort and security of an office job that is reliable, mm-hmm. and consistent, and not subject to, you know, the cortisol spikes of being an entrepreneur or on the cutting edge investor, these sorts of things. So I think that's another thing libertarians fail to empathize, is that people have different values and priorities in their lives. And not everyone is the John McAfee thrill seeker. And not everyone should be, because maybe if everyone was that, society might not be as, you know, that reliability of, I mean, society just being, I mean, not to be too Thomas Hobbesian, but you know, society serves a purpose of allowing me to exist in a way that I couldn't on my own, that I receive a lot of tangible benefits from being able to exist in society. And like I said, I think libertarians kind of miss the mark, or don't show that appreciation, going back to what we said at the beginning, just how fragile all this is, and how it doesn't take much for, yeah, like we're seeing with the pandemic, where the pandemic response has really fractured our society in two. And this is another interesting thing I noticed, and we can kind of transition to here, because I want to talk about Florida and some of the political science things. That's what I really, you know, was the purpose. How our society right now seems like almost perfectly fractured and schism in two. I mean, when you look at the voting results of Florida, how it's so almost closely and essentially evenly split. And again, going back to, I just keep thinking of like how this whole divide and conquer concept, I mean, that's a military tactic. That's been a military tactic since the Bronze Age. And now it's also seems to be this kind of psychological tactic that the media employs. And just like an interesting thing about divide and conquer as well, like it's not, at least for the psychological purposes of the powers that be that seem to be running their agenda on this nation, where it's not enough to get people just divided. They have to be expending their resources fighting each other. Mm-hmm. Because if they weren't wasting their resources fighting each other on divisive issues, whether it's abortion or gun control, or, I mean, just anything, the masking or the virus or any of these kind of political issues that people devote so much energy and attention into them, it's like, it's because we're fighting those that we deplete our energy, and it's because we're divided and we've spent our energy fighting one another. We seem to lack kind of the strength to stand on our own. So anyway, that was something I've just been thinking about, how in Florida particularly, which is one of the leaders of the free world, and I include you in that, it was really narrow. There seems to be a very almost perfectly, I didn't see the 2020 returns. I was looking at 2014 and 2018. So I don't know exactly how many points Trump won by in 2020. But in the 2018 election, it was very close. In the 2014, it was very close. And I know you had commented that 30,000 votes in Florida, you know, that decided which I think 30,000, that was it 30 or 60 was the margin? It was 60,000.
33,000 votes in 2018.
Was the margin.
Yep.
So that means that 16,500, if 16 and a half people swing their votes.
Right.
And there was there's no major third party on the ballot in 2018.
Correct.
Okay, so I mean, this is very interesting too. So just if you want to comment, I guess, how united is Florida in your, and not just from the panhandle perspective, but try to vision the whole state. How united is Florida behind DeSantis's leadership? What are your kind of just thoughts on the schisms and fractures that exist in American society? Again, at this time where, I mean, the empire has been in free fall, since Obama, at least from my perspective. I don't know, maybe the empire was pumped up under Trump with, an industrial resurgence or whatever. But yeah, I don't know. I threw a lot out there. What are your thoughts on some of the things I mentioned?
Well, Florida's a fascinating state for a variety of reasons. I mean, obviously, it's a transplant state by its nature. And so you have, it's a very diverse state politically. The Panhandle is culturally Southern. Central Florida is really like more culturally like Midwest. And then with a lot of farmland and some, there's a unique Florida flavor in there, but like a lot of it for our Midwestern settlers. And then in Miami, you have strong, Jewish, particularly retired, and Cuban populations down there. And so Florida has historically been a battleground state, obviously 2000 being the most infamous one. The interesting thing, but it's one of those states that's becoming redder. And part of that is the retiree aspect, because people don't want to pay extra taxes. And so you become more conservative in the age.
And there is no income tax in Florida.
Correct. There's no income tax. We spend the least amount of money per citizen for any state in the country, which is pretty miraculous when you consider, we have such a, considering the population of Florida. And so that's a strong suit as well. And so again, that tends to reflect anti-tax sentiments at a national level. That 2018 race, though, is particularly interesting. For one, like even before you get to the general election, that 2018 primary is, I think, one of the most powerful illustrations of the change of the Republican Party under Trump, because Ron DeSantis was, essentially a backbench congressman. In 2016, Ron DeSantis ran for Senate. Most people don't remember this. He spent millions of dollars. He ran from 2015 to June 2016. The primary's in August. And he managed 8% polling at that time. Marco Rubio leaves the presidential race, runs for Senate. He takes out the rest of the field. DeSantis stays in Congress. Then DeSantis becomes an ally of Trump. When you're running for Congress, and so Florida's a difficult state because it's so large, and you have a very expensive media markets in Miami and Orlando, Tampa, and a little bit in Jacksonville, right? And so it's an expensive state to run. It's a very large state to run. And so what's interesting is that the heir apparent, the guy that 99% of Republican Florida politics knew without a doubt was going to be the Republican nominee in 2018, was Adam Putnam. He was the agricultural commissioner. He had spent his entire adult life running for governor. I think he joined the state house when he was like 18. He became a congressman when he was like 27. He was garbage the entire time. He was a Republican that voted for the light bulb ban, Iraq war, every debt ceiling. He was stupid enough to fall for the cash for clunkers, Obama policy. And then he became an agricultural commissioner. He first got on my crap list because there was a local dairy that used to provide milk for the coffee house I worked at, little mom and pop shop. And because they wouldn't put additives in their skim milk, his Department of Agriculture told them, you can't sell that as skim milk in Florida, which is absurd. So he cared nothing about small mom and pop dairies. But he was the anointing one. 3 treats from Donald Trump took Ron DeSantis from being from being an unknown congressman to he crushed Adam Putnam by 20 percentage points. The problem is that DeSantis ran a bad campaign, and he continued to run a bad campaign during the general election. And then you have Andrew Gillum, who is a very charismatic, leftist, strong activist, sort of following, and who ran a very professional campaign outside of the fact that he's Andrew Gillum. And so DeSantis, I think that made that much narrower than it otherwise would have been. Otherwise, it was a pretty productive time for the Republican Party. We took the Senate seat. Rick Scott did. Lower margins, but Nelson hadn't come really close in the past. So that was a fascinating period there. So that's again 32,000 votes for the difference there. I mean, what's interesting is that DeSantis was able to increase turnout from Cubans from the 2016 vote with Trump. Part of that is his lieutenant governor candidate is from South Florida, a Cuban herself. And then he also received a lot of support from Tallahassee Black mothers who voted against the idea of having the first Black candidate, because it turns out on state issues, Black mothers care more about the education of their child than they do identity politics. Shocking. And so that was enough to get through. 2020 comes in, and Trump won by like 4 percentage points. Okay. Which is huge for Florida. And because the biggest turnaround was South Florida, Cuban, Hispanic heavy districts. And that's, I think, the most fascinating narrative of American politics right now, because you saw it not only reflected in Cubans, which their voting patterns are different. The left doesn't understand this, but Cuban Hispanic voting populations don't all vote the same. It's very different. You call a Mexican, Puerto Rican a Mexican, and see how they respond to that. Right. But it's also reflected on the border counties in Texas. And I think that's one of the interesting things going on, is that it is the militant cultural views of the left that are quickly radicalizing Christian demographics that are not typically Republican, in this case, Hispanic voters and others, pushing them to, I don't think that there's polling that shows that Hispanic voters are less interested in like gun rights and things like that. Maybe that's not true after what we've seen this past 2 years, but historically that's been the case. Those policy differences that may have kept them on the Democrat, they may not, maybe they disagree on economic policy here, there, whatever. Those political concerns are secondary to cultural concerns, because guess what? Hispanic males and down South Florida don't want their tax dollars to subsidize the mutilation of their boy, right? They don't want to be talking. They don't want to be discussing, the political agenda of Black Lives Matter, right? And so there is a major, I think, cultural backlash the left is facing, because they don't appreciate just how vulgar and offensive their, all men and all women, secular, militant policy is to these voters that are still Christian in value. And I think it could end up happening that the biggest bailout of conservatism after a century, basically, the conservative movement failing to conserve much, it is precisely the importation or the resettlement of genuine Christian voter demographics here that may end up doing a lot more for conservative political values than anything we got from the Heritage Foundation or anything like that. And it's precisely because the blind spot the left has for these things.
Hold on, because you just mentioned the Heritage Foundation. So there's a scandal, a fake scandal, a media-driven scandal in Iowa. We passed a very robust election security bill. We already had voter ID and really good elections, and we improved on that, and we outlawed ballot harvesting and some of these other practices.
Great.
And the Heritage Foundation supposedly on video, had some comment where it was perceived as if they were taking credit for the work. And now they're being investigated by the Iowa ethics for improper lobbying or something. And of course, Heritage had nothing to do with it. They're just in a meeting with donors, something good happened. And so they just wanted to somehow make it look like they were a part of it, when in actuality, they had nothing to do with it whatsoever. So there's a lot going on. You touched on a lot of different things. I appreciate that exposition. I want to just get that off my chest, because I think people need to know, certainly we at the grassroots, but hopefully more nationwide, how just all these big so-called conservative policy groups, and I would include Cato or whoever else in there too, really just don't do anything except for, sit on their butt. I did see, I think it was Cato, I saw an amicus brief filed, a friend of the court brief on a lawsuit against the DEA on an issue that I thought was good. But again, I just have to wonder, what are these, as far as activists are concerned, what is the professional political class doing with all this money? And then it is just really, really pathetic how a lot of these organizations or institutions operate. And I think Heritage is definitely in there. But anyway, another thing you said that stuck out was just how, you said DeSantis's campaign was poorly run. Thankfully, he was able to get the victory despite that. I think that's really important too, because I've ran a few campaigns, both winning and losing, and there's definitely, best practices and better practices and things that you shouldn't do under any circumstances. And I think just how important campaigns are that is your mode for connecting with the people. And like, I guess like a lot of libertarians just kind of scoff at that, be like, oh, campaigns are nothing more than, shallow 30-second TV ads and all this. And like, yeah, there's truth to that. There's a lot of campaigning that is a complete waste of money that's just lining some consultants' pockets. But at the same time, that is the method and mode that you can directly connect with people as a political candidate. So anyway, I think that's another thing that really sticks out in my mind and is really, really clear from like whenever Dave Smith talks. Like, to me, it's obvious that he's never worked professionally on a campaign or as a political consultant. And I don't know if I'm wrong about this, but I would suspect that he's probably never attended a political convention as a delegate either, because it's just, to me, it's very clear when someone's speaking that has no actual practical lived experience, like it kind of, it's, to me, I notice it. And so maybe I'll just hop in right here. And I think you've been really great at connecting with Dave Smith on some of these things. Obviously, I admire him as a comedian and as a thought leader. He says a lot. I tune into his podcast because he just says a lot of interesting things. He's a great entertainer. I don't like the way his co-host Robbie the Fire sometimes condones pornography. I think that's terrible and shouldn't be tolerated. But on the whole, as far as media is concerned, I like Dave Smith a lot more than, say, Sean Hannity or some of these other commentators, whatever. So I appreciate his value. I do want to just criticize a couple things that came up in that interview. Constructive criticism. And again, like, so much to dive into. I'll just say this, like, something you mentioned in the Rockwell Rothbard report was how there are these kind of libertarian types, or maybe libertines, I don't know what they're supposed to be called, but that there are people that purport themselves as libertarian, where it would be great to get as much distance as possible away from these people. So that's one thing I'd love to hear you kind of explain, but also tying in, so Dave Smith, a couple of things, he mentioned just how a presidential campaign really can galvanize the imagination of the people. And something I wanted to say earlier, but forgot was, as far as like leadership is concerned, like that's another thing too, when you're talking about you're working with your local party, like there are people that do want to be involved in local initiatives or in state initiatives, but it's just time consuming and it's confusing, so they don't know how. So they need that leader and that shepherd, someone that they can trust that can lead them to say, hey, vote this way because it'll lead to less taxes, or make sure you're paying attention to this because it looks like the city council's up to something that you might not be appreciative. And that's really just kind of my most time consuming part of my job is really just explaining to people what the government is up to and why I think they might be up to it. And I find myself getting kind of impatient sometimes because for me, as someone who's worked in the legislature for 3 years now and has been a political activist for 10 years or more than a decade, like there are things that I forgot how, when just starting out, how confusing things can be and how complicated the law is and how many questions there are on it when applying the law. And so that was something I found myself just being kind of impatient, like trying to explain something like the conditions in which someone can decline a vaccine. It's like, well, haven't you been paying attention? Why don't you know this already? Like, why aren't you following my Facebook more carefully? Because I've explained this already, type of thing. So there's just really that need of leaders to break it down for people and make it to where they can get involved, because they don't have a spare hour to figure it all out by themselves, because they're not going to take that time away from their kids, and they shouldn't, because their kids are their priority. But if we can sit through, break it down, and make it easy that, hey, you don't need to take an hour, but you can take 2 minutes to write this email or 10 minutes to go to the polls and vote, then it becomes easy and accessible. And anyway, the reason I was going with this is because Dave Smith was talking a lot about how, we need the presidential candidate is the one that can galvanize and inspire the imagination of the people. And I think as leaders, leadership is just defined to me as, well, one, the basic definition is a leader is someone who can direct people and resources. To what end, that's up to the leader. But if someone, and there are a lot of leaders, so-called leaders, that if they look behind themselves, no one's following them, they're not really a leader. And higher, maybe leadership, a leader is someone who takes responsibility for any aspect. If I take the responsibility of cleaning the trash off the sidewalk, I've de facto become a leader in my community in terms of trash pickup. And then also, I think the higher level as a leader is someone who needs to communicate vision. And I think that's where we talk about the presidential campaigns. But I think it's definitely true for even someone running for vice chair of the local Republican Party. What is your vision? Where do you want to take the Republican Party? Where do you want to take our county institutions? Where do you want to take the United States of America? And I think that's been the deficiency with Libertarian Party candidates, is they fail to articulate any sort of vision at all that can be grappled with or inspire the imagination of the people. And I think that's why Joe Jorgensen has been so forgettable, deservedly so. I think this guy, Spike Cohen, I've been more impressed with him. I don't know him all too well, but I see him posting things on Facebook and adopting these messaging strategies that to me cultivate more trust. And it shows that, okay, this guy is empathetic with the things I'm concerned about and is likely conducting himself in a way that shows empathy to a wide variety of others as well. So I've been more impressed with Spike Cohen. But anyway, to me, it was just really, I thought, very shallow of Dave Smith's analysis that, running for president is the only way that's going to somehow galvanize this libertarian movement. Although admittedly, like the Libertarian Party, yeah, that's the basic function, is fielding candidates who can articulate a vision, and they failed to do so. And then just to get off my chest, and I'll just hand it back to you, but the other couple thoughts I had is, he gave DeSantis a hard time because of his position on Israel, which is interesting. This was a hypothetical. I believe you guys were talking about a hypothetical DeSantis presidential run, which at the present trajectory, DeSantis seems like the go-to leader of the National Republican Party. So that's a possibility. But how can you attack a guy for a hypothetical position that he hasn't taken for an office that he's not actually declared running for, and then use that as kind of like, it was very dismissive that, how could I follow this guy because he's got a position on Zionism that is, it was completely tone deaf to the reality of AIPAC or Israel as a force in American politics, and certainly the Jewish demographic in the state of Florida, which you already mentioned. And again, it's just like one of those things where, like, a libertarian, when I heard him talk about that, it's like, he's making up reasons. He's making up excuses to not follow DeSantis. And then again, to me, that was just like a weak cop out, and really just shows again that not engaging with the world, or in DeSantis in this case, because there is a lot to be discussed about Zionism, both historically and in present day, and it shouldn't anyway. But where I really want to go, and I'm sorry, I just threw like 4 or 5 big topics at you.
But keep it that.
I previously tweeted about, I did a couple quick Google searches, and I completely dismissed the Libertarian Party of Florida offhand. But then when I dug a little bit deeper in preparation of this interview, I did see something very interesting and frankly hopeful and encouraging from the Libertarian Party ticket in 2014 that did indicate that, okay, maybe this is a political force that could be valuable in a way. So that's where I want to take the next conversation, is this guy, Andrew Wiley or whatever, and why you decided to vote. What's his name?
Adrian Wiley.
Oh, Adrian Wiley, whatever. Sorry, but no disrespect to Mr. Wiley. But that's where I kind of want to take the conversation in terms of what the Libertarian Party of Florida, what role they actually could play, and then kind of the political science analysis of how a Libertarian Party of Florida might actually impact an electoral or a policy outcome. And there was another piece of that too. But anyway, so I just bit off a lot, but those are really some of the main topics I wanted to explore with you. And I'm glad we finally got to it after about 45 minutes of talking. So
well, let me work backwards, because I think I'll flow well. Because the Libertarian Party of Florida is interesting. I mean, my understanding, again, because I'm just a nerd and I spend way too much time on this. Like I pay attention to libertarian politics a lot more than I should.
Well, so are you personally acquainted with like the Libertarian Party chairman of Florida?
No, not currently.
Okay.
I knew. I had beers with Adrian Wiley back during his 2014 campaign, and I know the people here locally. Most of them voted for Trump in 2020, which is great. But I follow them, and my understanding is that the Florida LP leadership, even before this Mises Caucus takeover, and I think your average Mises Caucus person is much better than your average LP person. So I give them props for that.
I was just assuming they were the same people. And apparently they're not, which is incredibly alarming.
No, but the LP of Florida was always more inclined to it. I mean, I think the chairman of it endorsed Josh Smith in his anti-Nick Sarek run in 2016 or 2018. So Florida's always been interesting, and Wiley is the most impressive Libertarian candidate outside of James Morris, who's a local mechanic who ran for county commission, whose campaign I helped on. The second most impressive Libertarian candidate I've ever met, because he was a radical dude, but he also seemed to have money in his wallet that wasn't just purely from liberty stuff, right? So he wasn't a career liberty activist, but he was also radical. He made a big deal about driving around without a driver's license and protests of the real ID laws and things like that. But he was smart, knew his stuff.
We're talking about Adrian now?
Yeah, Adrian Wiley, yeah.
Because the real ID was one of the issues he campaigned on, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And so, which is great. And so he ended up getting like over 200,000 votes in 2014, which is scary, looking like, oh, well, if the LP runs and he gets half of that in 2022, like that could radically change that election. So Wiley and the LP of Florida, I think, has always been interesting. What I've been trying to push, and I got in a very long-winded Twitter spat with whoever runs the account for the LP of Florida now, is that—
Oh, awesome. I should have looked this up in preparation for the interview. I'm sorry. You have to send it to me.
So again, this is one of my frustrations with the LP, is that, okay, like if the LP is not going to win elections, and they kind of recognize that, at least in the short term, well, then what they should be doing is trying to influence politics without winning elections. And you can do that by developing political capital and using political capital. And so here right now, most honest libertarians will admit that Ron DeSantis did COVID better than anyone else, given the circumstances. I mean, some might argue Kristi Noem, but Florida is very different than South Dakota.
I would say Florida did better from my analysis, because DeSantis took the position, he assembled the roundtable scientists and crafted his own narrative.
Yes.
And so he directly pushed back on the foundations of the Chinese totalitarian lockdown in a way that Noem did not.
He created an intellectual parallel body, which is important. And so I don't think the LP of Florida has interest in running against DeSantis, which would be good, because I think that would undermine the LP brand, because it shows
but then again, sorry, it's just like political Machiavellianism, and this is where, like, if I was a DeSantis political consultant, obviously the governor wouldn't want anything to do with this, but a political consultant, and this is where the sophistication of political consultants, where I think that's where we really, really have a dearth, where the opposing side, I mean, the political scientists, the propagandists, the Edward Bernays that were able to engineer World War I and World War II, those are political scientists that are masters of public relations. They're masters of human behavior. They know just how to manipulate people. If I wanted, and this is just an idea, this could be the worst idea ever, but if I was DeSantis's advisor, and again, I don't know, maybe he's in such a strong position he doesn't need to do this, but from my thinking, like, how would you run? Because it'd be possible to run a libertarian candidate designed in a way to attack the Democrat, basically, or leech votes from the Democrat. And why Florida is so significant for this discussion as well, I forgot to mention, is I believe, and my history could be wrong, I'm not as fluent as you, but it was after the 2000 Florida debacle, where there was a very thin margin that did decide the presidency. And I believe Ralph Nader was on the ticket. Was it Reform Party or Green Party that Nader was Green? And the margin that Ralph Nader got was sizable, to where they accused him of stealing the victory from Gore. And I believe Ralph Nader's response was, well, if that's the case, then good, because then maybe they'll run a more progressive platform next time. And in 8 years after that, the Democrat platform had gone significantly more progressive under Barack Obama, who was the progressive versus Clinton in that 2008 primary. And I guess that's the textbook, that's the high school textbook value of a third political party in our political system, is being able to cost the election for one way or another. Now, there is this sentiment that, a libertarian would naturally detract votes from DeSantis, but I think the opposite could also be true if that was, intended by design, of fielding a candidate that was going to run a campaign and host a platform that was, uniquely tailored to undercut his opponent or something. Anyway, just some ideas, but
I think in a normal year that would be, I think there'd be some openings there. And I think what's interesting is that like an LP candidate running for agricultural commissioner on a single platform of marijuana, which has honestly no impact. Like the agricultural commissioner, like there's a very, like it doesn't, you know, like, but yeah. You hear you would assume it does. That is where I think there could be a Machiavellian play there. The problem is that like 95% of libertarians are going to vote for DeSantis because of the lockdown issue alone. I mean, you have that. Like that's and so any LP or LP registered voters that you get going to that candidate are going to be, I think, a net negative. Even if like the LP ran like a leftward facing candidate to try to pick up, you know, because particularly in this race, because your candidates are either going to be Nikki Fried, who's like a former marijuana lobbyist, and so like if that's going to be the direction you're going to go as the LP, like she's already strong. Like if that's your number one issue, like Nikki Fried already gives you that. If that's your movement advocacy, and so the dynamic. And the other one's Charlie Crist, who might make. I mean that might open up some things there. But I think the bigger move is that, and I think it's something to be mutually beneficial, is that the LP of Florida should obviously endorse Ron DeSantis, because if they're not planning on running anyone against them, then what they can do.
Well, hold on. So in 2018, they didn't, right? There was no libertarian candidate. Right. There was that Senate candidate who was obviously a detriment, and I think really an example of how you can harm yourself politically, and how you can go out of your way to prevent people from taking yourself seriously when you. Augustus or whatever that gentleman.
So that was 2016. That was 2016.
Oh, that was 16?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, I thought that was 18. Okay, but then I guess so if the purpose of the basic purpose of a political party is essentially to field candidates.
Right.
Now, the candidate you field obviously can mean a bunch of different things. You could, you could have a presidential candidate like Ron Paul, or you could have a presidential candidate like Gary Johnson. You could get very different results because they're very different people. But so if the Libertarian Party of Florida isn't fielding candidates, at least for governor, you'd think they'd want someone at the top of the ticket. I mean, then I just wonder what it is that they are existing for. I mean, I don't know.
Well, they're there too. Like, and they'll say like, oh, it's because we want to engage at the local level. But the problem is that you don't really engage at the local level if you're talking past them. And I think it's unfortunate because like with this political capital, like they could have like let's say that the Ron DeSantis world, who maybe they have like the vanity value of like, oh yeah, I'm a bipartisan candidate. I've done so well in Florida that I've got other parties endorsing me. I think there's some vanity play there. Maybe the LP could trade that for like a governor appointed position on like a task force trying to figure out Florida's cryptocurrency landscape, or someone like Tom Woods having an advisory position on high school social studies.
Yeah, I heard you say that.
Not that he'd be interested in that, but like there's a way that you can. Because the problem is the LP of Florida doesn't understand how to develop political capital, and then has no interest in figuring out how it could use political capital.
Well, so my question would be, for the 2014 campaign where they got 200,000 votes statewide.
Yeah.
Which is a lot, equal to the population of Bay County. 200,000 is nothing to scoff at. Does the Libertarian Party of Florida know who those people are, and are they connected with them in any meaningful way?
Probably not, because they haven't had a national apparatus since then. They haven't had a statewide candidate really since then, because the LP Senate thing in 2016, where you had the civil war between this Augustus Olibiscus, who I think is in jail now.
He sounded like someone who belonged in jail, which
it was
typically I'm anti-incarceration, but just reading this guy just gave me a lot of bad vibes, man.
He was an interesting guy. And the other guy, and so they haven't had a statewide apparatus ever since. And I think they're trying to build whatever, but like, their biggest victory was not spoiling DeSantis's race in 2018.
Oh, that's a gigantic victory. That's amazing. I mean, that's going to be celebrated around the world for years to come. That's amazing. So then my question would be this then. So if they don't have active connection with any of the 200,000 voters that came out in 2014, then they don't really have any political power, because any political power would be connecting, those voters. And like we said, even if they had 15,000 voters, which, I mean, they might. I mean, do you guys have ballot? Do you guys register for parties in Florida? Like, are there registered libertarians?
Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe there is a voter list of registered libertarians out there. But like I said, I mean, these people, who knows what they're going to do? And there are a lot of people. I mean, I know libertarians that would never ever vote for a Republican or a Democrat under any circumstances, and that's why they're libertarian. So it's like those voters aren't necessarily in play, and you can't make claims that, oh, they're playing spoiler, unless you really have a lot of data to back that up. But so anyway, I just wanted to kind of throw those comments out there because, like, yeah, if the Libertarian Party was in a position, they're like, oh, this is our email list of 20,000 people, and this is our list of 500 donors, and we know exactly where they live, and we know their phone numbers, and we're going to be in touch, and we know we're going to be able to influence their vote one way or another. Then all of a sudden they are in that kind of kingmaker position, or at least potentially able to flip a direction, an election, a statewide election, one way or another. But absent that infrastructure of email lists that have been contacted, opened, I mean, that actual human connection that would exist, then they don't really have any political leverage or power, and that any influence they would have. And I was saying, from based on this conversation, I'm open to the idea that the Libertarian Party endorsing someone like DeSantis would be a benefit. But it's just hypothetical. I mean, it can't necessarily be proven or demonstrated by any of the data I've seen. But again, it could be, because that Adrian Wiley seemed like a good enough guy where all he was a talk show host, but he had a platform and he had some issues he cared about. And he cared so much about the issues that he was willing to violate the law. I guess that's what really impresses me too, that I see all the time. It's like, I don't really care so much as what you believe. What are you willing to do to enact those beliefs? Right. And that's why I'm so enamored and infatuated with the conservative Christians and with the religious, because a lot of those guys, the sincerely believing ones, are willing to, go to jail or be crucified or whatever. Where, anyway, like, there's so much of the political intensity element of it. Like I said, it's not so much what you believe. What are you willing to do about it?
Right.
And I think that's the thing with why the left really is weak, and why the left, once you get them outside of their mobs, they really are just weak people. And they only have that strength when they're in that mob, when they have that hive mind mentality, because that's the only instance where a weak person can feel strong. But if you pin them off one by one, they're not willing to go far out of their way to, they're only willing to do it when the media directs them and when it feels safe to do so. Mm-hmm. They lack any sort of courage or clarity of their convictions, aside from, the one random weirdo who is willing to shoot up a congressional baseball team or something, or whatever it is that they do. But anyway, that's just another kind of interesting element I've noticed. But anyway, what do you think about my libertarian analysis?
No, I think you're correct. I mean, it reminds me of the old, I think it's in the Seem to Lead line about, like, don't tell me your economic views, show me your portfolio. Like, when you're in the game is when it really, you really reveal yourself. And I do think that this is a larger libertarian problem overall. And I think it kind of goes to some of the points that you're asking about the debate with Dave. Because I think one of the things that influences Dave perhaps is, if you live in New York City, you've lived in one of the worst places in the US. And I think it's very easy to take a very very, very dark view of politics, which to me, the Libertarian Party strategy as a whole is, to use the internet lingo, black-pilled, because it's saying that there's no hope in the traditional political process as it exists, and that only by trying this desperate attempt to awaken, like, this political revolution is the only chance we're going to have any sort of steps to liberty. And I obviously don't think that, because I've been one of the freest people in the world the last year. Because of
and that's what I think that black-pilled mentality is a result of not really being connected to the actual power structures and witnessing how politics actually works.
Yeah. And that's something you have a libertarians that they think that they have a lot of strong political views, and they'll go on and on about, let's say, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and have a lot of sometimes a lot of great value out of that conversation, and they don't know how their city council runs.
Right. Oh, that's fascinating too. I love that element about the Israel-Palestine thing, where it's halfway around the world, and all of a sudden we have these pseudo experts on this intractable conflict, and yet, and like you said, they're all that, and that's what's so interesting too about the intangible, about how important human attention is, and why I'm so vocally anti-television, because it does rot your mind, or at least disassociates you from your thinking in a way that kind of numbs you. And I think that is more than anything, probably in my estimation, combined with all this digital technology, including the phone I'm talking at right now, is really stressing these political bonds and allows these controllers to influence and guide the masses and lead us for better or for worse. So
and I think that's in an interesting way, the disruption in entertainment delivery is one of the things that's fueling this polarization, because now more than ever before, you think about, like, living in the 1990s politics, and then the further back you go, the further of the networks that you can choose go down, right? You think about when you have 3 networks, for example, how much common information digestion was shared, was common, right? You either, when you watched Walter Cronkite at night, not only did you believe him when he said, when he told you, hey, this now you know, but like your neighbors were watching him too, and your community was watching. You probably had like 30-40% of communities watching that one show, getting their news from that one show. Now we're living in an age where you have so much disruption of consumption. You have people watching TV less, if they're watching TV also in streaming services, and so maybe they're living the 90s from that consumption standpoint. And I think it matters because so much of the left's power has come from its use of normalizing cultural issues through entertainment. Like, it's interesting when you watch like 90s, early 20s, or early 2000s shows, like how frontal they put like single mothers. And like they celebrate like that aspect of, it's true in like Frasier, it's true like so many of the sitcoms in the 90s, like that's Murphy Brown, right? That's put up as the pinnacle and purely celebrated, and like that was because that was part of a larger sort of cultural push there.
Well, right around the same time of the dopey male too, and then the father figure being unmasculine or whatever.
Yes, and so now we're living in an age where like the one last kind of bastion of like water cooler talk, and I think we as human beings we take for granted the importance of small talk, right? Having conversations that you can talk with your neighbors that you have nothing else in common. Like sports used to be that, and now sports is politicized, and so like we're wearing away all of the cultural consumption. We're politicalizing it, all of it, in a way that I think. And I think that's why like people found themselves like attracted to like Trump rallies, because like that was it was entertainment in a community of shared value, and that's something where again like libertarians, when libertarians get so focused in like just simply consuming libertarian podcasts, for example, and have no understanding of what your average Fox News viewer views the world, or your average Rush Limbaugh listener. Or an MSNBC person, or someone that listens to Pod Save America. Like I don't want to simply rely upon television within that. Then like it makes it even more difficult to interact. And I think that there's so much there's so much assumption with like the entire Dave Smith strategy that if now we can change the world now because we can go talk to Joe Rogan and Tim Pool, and we're going to tap into this major network of cultural power and things. I don't think that really exists. Like for one, like if you look at like the alternative media candidates during 2020, all of them failed spectacularly. They all underperformed. Like Andrew Yang underperformed what they were looking at early on in that race. Tulsi Gabbard honestly was nothing. Unfortunately, I love Tulsi Gabbard. I have a lot of respect for her, but she was Joe Rogan's favorite candidate. Did nothing. Andrew Yang underperformed. Bernie Sanders. The candidate that won the Democratic primary was the one that did no alternative media, Joe Biden, right? And it's like I think we get ourselves, we confuse our own consumption patterns, and then we extrapolate like, most of America interacts the same way. No, and that's why Trump, I think, was such a powerful figure, and that's all things like Dave Smith's trying to replicate the Trump formula, right? I'm sorry, like. Dave Smith's wonderful. I tremendous respect. Again, I would much rather have. I agree with Dave Smith probably on regular issues than I do Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a once in a lifetime figure. Like he was a reality show. The one thing Donald Trump does better than anyone else is branding and attention. And when he was able to take and kind of flip on the left that cultural weaponization, the left built him with Celebrity Apprentice and all these things.
Well, and then he
That's what
sucked
made it
up.
such a powerful force.
Well, then, yeah, in the 2015 cycle, when the media was nonstop talking about Donald Trump, obviously in the negative, but again, all the attention was on him, and we didn't give us any room to pay attention to anyone else. So I've often kind of wondered, about just how all these different things react to one another, and again, just trying to suss out what's really going on. I mean, as far as like media is concerned, I really appreciate Whitney Webb. I don't know if you're familiar with her reporting at all. I don't agree with everything she says. I think sometimes maybe she's a little bit more black-pilled than she needs to be. But anyway, I know we're getting into time. We've covered a lot of ground. This was just a pilot episode of Jeff Shipley's Political Science podcast. But I guess, is there anything else that anything else you want to talk about? I mean, I don't know if we actually discussed any of these topics in depth or gave them justice the way they really need to be, but we covered a lot of things. What would be your close on whatever else you want to share, and then just some political science wisdom you want to leave with our viewers?
Well, I want to circle back to and hit on 2 points that you made earlier. For one is the poor quality of kind of conservative political candidates and the larger issues with, say, the conservative Inc. apparatus based in DC, the heritages of the world. And it's precisely the fact that they have no vision for what a conservative America looks like, because there's such a disconnect from ideology at this point. And so, well,
but also whenever you take a position on anything, you risk alienating someone,
right?
Like that's the other thing too, that makes politics so difficult, and why we are just playing it so safe is because these issues are complicated. And by saying anything, even if you went to your local city council meeting and said, hey, this stop sign is causing me some problems or something, like someone's gonna be like, no, this stop sign is really, really important to me. Why would you ever question it? So that it's impossible not to rock the boat, even when you just open your mouth.
Yeah. And so what I think that's important. And I think there's a lot of fractions on the right. And I think there's some common threads to do it. So I think it's important to articulate a vision for, the American right. And my vision is that the main driving goal should be the destruction of federal power anytime we can do so, and empowering local and civic institutions as much as possible. And I think that in the past, the focus has been on conservative reforms at national levels. Like, no, the future of the GOP is DeSantis-style executive leadership, where utilizing every single levels of power. Like, for example, the big tech issue. What's interesting, go look at Cato, and you look at some of these organizations, and you Google Ron DeSantis, and you see how often they talked about Ron DeSantis's, liberalizing the Florida economy during COVID, or pushing back against COVID tyranny. And like, you get like one article, and then the rest are like criticizing him for banning private vaccine passports. And then the big tech stuff goes on, and they hyperventilate. And like if going back, at one point we're talking about understanding where true power lies. Like, if you're a libertarian and like you're understanding like big tech as a corporate as an enterprise is like
so
grounded and like binary, like, oh, private property rights, government has no role here, then like you become that useful idiot, or Mises's term was useful innocent, for the left, because what you're doing is that you're assuming that Facebook and these large tech giants are meritocratic market actors, and they're not.
Right.
These are institutions saturated with state privilege, and to me, like, this populist sphere that we're living in, obviously a lot of it is resistance to power, not just state but corporate and other and cultural zeitgeist power, right? And I think what's important is, going back to the importance of personality and icons, my goal is to reduce or try to focus as much as that populist energy every single way I can, any way I can, into what I'm going to call Jacksonian style populism, which was the old American tradition of railing against state privilege. It was railing against corporate financial land speculators and the Bank of the United States and all that sort of stuff, right? These platforms that strengthen and institutionalize corrupt cronyist actors. Because the alternative to that is the other great American strong man. It's Teddy Roosevelt. And there you had an attempt to control and harness corporate power for your own desires. When it was trust busting, it was usually busting the bad trust and rewarding the good trust, right? And so this is where this battle lies, because if we simply and there's a lot of push like, oh, we need to nationalize Facebook and Twitter because that way, you know, we can install conservatives. Like, obviously, that's not going to happen. If you nationalize them, the left is going to benefit from the battleground of federal politics and federal regulatory bodies. Like the fairness doctrine was used to silence conservative radio, and it wasn't to provide platform to dissident voices. And so that is the possible failure if the populist movement of the American right now becomes undermined and compromised. It's going to be that attraction to federal power at the expense of getting serious about this state privilege and taking that Jacksonian swing of things. And the good thing is that, you know, we do have people that I think are providing voices out there that provide interesting platforms to do it. And you know, regardless of what you think about everything else around him, like Matt Gaetz, when Matt Gaetz gave a talk, this is what I've had a lot of fun because I've been pushing this Libertarians that have been kind of on the fence after that Dave Smith event. So if you watch Matt Gaetz articulate his vision of the Republican Party when he flew into Liz Cheney's backyard in Wyoming, and was railing against them, like it's perfect. It sounds like Matt Gaetz, right? So it doesn't sound like Ron Paul. You know, it has a little bit of, you know, he's a lawyer by trade. It has a little bit of that into it, but the substance is great. And if you can back up the rhetoric with substance and make the GOP embody that, then we have something interesting. We have something that can really rackle the feathers of the most horrible people in the empire. And so that's so to me, like, you have to have that vision and you have to have something that you're working towards. And so what I'm trying to work towards is, you know, the America First, you know, Trump style.
Your sound
Matt
just got
Gaetz
way
Republican.
better.
Yeah. So I didn't realize this headset doesn't work. And so I fell down and I didn't realize the mic was on this side. So I apologize.
Oh, that's what happened the whole time. All right. Well, hey,
but this was fun.
No, a couple of things just to sum up here. First, as a Cherokee Indian, I'm pretty triggered about Andrew Jackson.
Understandable.
But I believe in tolerance and diversity as a Republican Party virtue. So I accept you as you are. No, we've covered a lot of things. There's so much more to go into. Even when you mentioned someone like Teddy Roosevelt too, like how these political leaders are in many ways larger than life figures that really can cultivate that imagination. And so, yeah, how much of politics really happens within the imagination and the attention span of each of us as individuals. I think that's just kind of what I've been wanting to flesh out. But this has been great.
One more point on that, though, is I really like this.
Go ahead.
Is that, again, and this is interesting, something libertarians don't understand. It's like the entire Austrian economics at the fundamental basis, understanding subjective value. The value of a good is not in the objective good itself, but it's in the way that we as consumers perceive it. And it's just as true in politics. And so what's important about these strongman figures is not simply that they're these larger than life caricatures that we've built up in these mythical things. It's how are they used? And so, for example, go back to the American Revolution, Alexander Hamilton was conservative in the British sense, you know, a kind of a counter-revolutionary force in early American politics. And Jefferson was obviously, you know, a revolutionary, you know, the figure of the Enlightenment, right? But if we as Americans come to respect Hamilton because of his defense of private property contracts, you know, defending loyalists, you know, against the mob, and that's a private property aspect to it. If that's what we celebrate him, then that provides value if you value private property. If you look at if Jefferson is perceived for his French revolutionary, you know, egalitarianism, that was kind of dangerous, right? It ended poorly. Then regardless of his own accomplishments, if that's what people are seeing in it, then it becomes detrimental. And so it's not only that these figures exist and have these myths, but it's what about these people are being pushed. And that's what makes them particularly powerful icons.
Well, it's just human beings. I guess to sum it up this way, I mean, human beings are enormously complicated people, and in the whole realm of human actions, that people are going to act in a way that might be virtuous, and maybe they won't. Because whatever you'll get whatever you're looking for. You can look at DeSantis and you can see a leader of the free world who's a hero in the face of insurmountable evil, or you can look and find things that you might not appreciate. But again, it's what are you looking for? And that's where your mind is. And my political science or political art would be that we're always looking for the best in people. And I think that's why we need to invest in relationships. I mean, You mentioned Tulsi Gabbard, you mentioned Gore Vidal, all these other people that are not traditional libertarians, but still offer value to the political marketplace in a way that we need to relate to constructively. And so anyway, there's a lot of that, I guess, self-destructive, self-defeating libertarian, just that a lot of these, we're our own obstacle, our own worst enemy in a lot of different ways. I know that's certainly been true throughout my own personal political career, so I'm speaking from experience. But no, this has been a lot of fun. There's a lot more to talk about. I'd love to reconnect with you a month down the road. Maybe test out the sound a little bit more, maybe get you some more, a better visually inspiring background.
Okay, I'm getting my office set up soon. I'll have a full library set up soon.
What are you going to be back in Auburn then? How often do you go to Auburn?
I'll be up there next week. We have our Rothbard graduate seminar, which is a week-long program with graduate
How long
students.
of a drive is that for you?
That's 3.5, 4 hours, depending on traffic in Dothan.
How often do you get up there? Like once a month, or how often is it?
Once a month.
Well, because if I should do it from the Iowa Capitol and you could do it from the Mises Institute, then it would be very visually appealing.
Those are great.
All right, so I got this recording on the cloud. I'm going to figure out how to retrieve it from the cloud and then upload it on YouTube. How many views do you think we're going to get on YouTube from this? 25?
I think we can go north of 25.
I'm at 100 or some subscribers right now. I think if we get 30 views, that'd be pretty good.
Okay, yeah, we'll see what we can do.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time this morning. I really appreciate your political science perspective, and I just respect you as an activist. Any human being who's willing to put their name on the line in service to the community, I think is really something that's inspiring and that I admire a lot. So just thank you so much, though, for all you do, not just for your family and Bay County Republicans, but for the state of Florida and the United States of America as well. God bless you and freedom.
Yeah, well, thank you. As I always enjoy talking with you, and look forward to joining you again.
All right. Fantastic. See you later. Have a good one.
You do the same.